Well, hello there and welcome to this video. This video is all about giving you some secret tips for success for delivering a presentation online. Now, very shortly, in a couple of days' time, you may be delivering your presentation online as part of your TAE. And I may be your facilitator, I may not be, but this video is all about giving you some secret tips to be really successful in your delivery, right? So if you are watching this video, I highly recommend that you take some notes and you start to think about some of the things that I'm going to share with you. Now, as I go through each of the points here, it's all about setting you up for success. Now, you may have already made your PowerPoint, you may not have, but if you already have, that's fine. You can add some of these things in here. Now, I'm going to go through each of the points. I'm going to explain them, and I would love you to go away and think about them and definitely implement them when you come to deliver your session, so to speak. Now, delivering online is an awesome skill set to have, and it is a great realm to go into. And, things in life, can be new, and it's not necessarily the case that it's hard or difficult. It's just many times for people, it's just unfamiliar and they haven't done it before. And myself, as a very experienced presenter in a face-to-face environment, I had to get used to doing certain things in the online environment that were new for me, and I needed to be able to embrace a new skill set, right? So this video is going to give you some tips on how to develop that skill set and some ways to be super successful on your presentation there. So let's jump into it. So the first thing I want to bring to your attention is do and know. So I'm just going to make that really big for you to see there. Do and know, 90%, right? So I'm just going to focus on that one for just a moment. Now, we need to appreciate that when we deliver a presentation, people forget 90% of what we actually tell them. People forget 90% of what we actually tell them. People forget 90% of what we actually tell them, right? So what we want to encourage you to do is think about, if your audience were going to remember just one thing, what is the one thing that you really want your audience to remember? So if you're talking about leadership, maybe there is just one particular thing about leadership that you really want them to remember. Okay. So what do you want them to know and go away and not forget? Now, the next piece is the do, the action. Okay. So if you were talking about leadership or even safety or whatever your topic is, maybe it's CPR, maybe it's snake bites, whatever it might be, right? What is the one thing that you want them to go out and do? Do you want them to go out to the supermarket or to the I don't know, the first aid shop and buy a particular bandage? Do you want them to get a first aid kit? What do you want them to physically do as a result of listening to you? Do you want them to have the song Staying Alive in their mind as they do the compressions? Do you want them to never forget the numbers in relation to the compressions? All right. What's the one thing that you really want them to do as a result of listening to you? It's a really important point, because many times people put together presentations and they go slide one, slide two, slide three. Here's the legislation. Here's the policy. Here's a procedure. Here's how to do manual handling. Here's a video. Here's a video. Here's a video, which is all fine. But at the end of the day, if you deliver a session and people do what they've always done and never do anything different, well, you may not have really maximized the opportunity, so to speak. So if you're putting together your session, or even if you already have, I highly encourage you to ask yourself, out of this 20-minute session or this 40-minute session I'm delivering, what's the one thing that I really want them to not forget or remember for the rest of time? And as a result of listening to my presentation, what's the one thing I want them to go out and do? Now, if you identify that, the way that you show up and talk about your topic is going to radically change, because it's all going to be geared towards what people should do as a result of listening to you. All right. The energy is going to be very different. Okay. So let's go to one example, manual handling. Okay. So what's the one thing that you want them to walk away and know? Okay. You want them to know the 3 steps to lifting a box. Okay, great. Then what do you want them to do? Well, next time they see a box and they need to lift it up, you want them to pause and think. Pause and think. All right, so that's a pretty clear example there. So you want them to know this and you want them to go ahead and do that. All right, so now let's head to the second point here, folks. The second point here is a very, very important one. It says make your slides readable. Make your slides readable. Okay, so I'm just going to expand this one, make it as big as we can here so you guys can read it. So make your slides readable. What do I mean by this? Well, we need to appreciate in the online environment, the more you put on the slides, the worse it is. The more you put on the slides, the worse it is. Instead, what you want to have is 3, maybe 4 major bullet points, and that's it. Or you want to have some images, but please, please, please do not put, 6, 8, 10, 20 bullet points on the slide, because when you are a participant and you're watching that, it's very heavy on the brain, heavy on the eyes, and it's really hard for your participants to stay focused, right? So you really want to strip back information from the slides. Also, I do want to encourage you to think about the font and the color. So the font you want to make as big as possible, and color-wise, you want to avoid red and green as much as you can, because for many people, those colors are a little bit hard to digest and look at for long periods of time, particularly if people are colorblind there, right? So make your slides readable. All right. So now let's come to point number 3 here. All right. So point number 3 here, one of my favorites is learning outcomes. I'm just going to make this as big as I can, learning outcomes, so that it really stands out. All right. So learning outcomes, magic number of 3. Magic number of 3. What we mean by this is when you are delivering your session, what we often find is that people come along to this workshop and they have like 6 learning outcomes, or they have 10 learning outcomes. And I sometimes listen to that and go, wow, that's setting yourself up for an interesting session there. That's really ambitious for both the trainer, you, and the audience members there, right? So you want to have maximum 3 learning outcomes. So it could be by the end of the session, you will be able to do this, this, and this. Or by the end of the session, you will have the skills, the knowledge, and the structure to be able to do X, Y, Z. Or by the end of the session, you will have the confidence, the know-how, and the tactics to be able to do X, Y, Z. Or by the end of the session, you will understand the 3 steps to do X, Y, Z. Or by the end of the session, you will be able to identify 3 personality profiles and link them to the best situation or the scenario. All right. So we're just really drilling down on our learning outcomes. And in total, we've got 3. Any more than 3, you're probably being a little bit ambitious for yourself and your learners there. Even if you got 40 minutes to attack or achieve more than 3, you are potentially being ambitious there. So just something to think about. All right. And the clearer you are on those outcomes, the better it is for you and your audience, right? Now, next one is a little bit of a logistics, bit of a housekeeping one, and it's a bit of a common sense one. But let me just fix the typo there. So bringing up. All right. So in this case, because you're delivering on Zoom, we do highly recommend that you practice bringing up your slides, practice shifting over to another screen. So maybe you are going to show a video on YouTube. Maybe you're going to do that. So in that case, make sure that you can practice going between different screens. Make sure you practice bringing up your slides. Don't leave it to the day of the event to practice doing it. All right, because you want to look professional, you want to look like you know what you're doing, and as much as possible, even if you don't know how to do that, go onto YouTube and watch a couple of videos on how to bring up slides on Zoom, right? It's very, very simple. It's easy, but it just takes practice, right? It just takes practice, just like any skill in life, right? So you want to practice bringing up different screens, maybe bringing up a YouTube screen, maybe bringing up a home page if you're adding those kind of things there as well. Okay. So next, point number 5 here. Let's drop into it. All right. Again, a little bit of a logistics, housekeeping manner here. I'm going to bring this up so that you guys can see it here. Number five. All right. So number five is test your video and your camera before the day. Great idea here, folks. So this one, get used to being able to mute and unmute yourself. Get used to actually turning on your camera, turning off your camera, and get used to that functionality so that when you turn up on the day, you know how to mute yourself, unmute yourself, turn on your camera, turn your camera off, and you're all squared away on that. And as an audience member, you will be expected to have your camera on the entire time, just out of respect and courtesy for sure. So make sure you're aware of how to turn your camera on, turn your video on, turn it off, and all of that fun stuff there. All right. And also make sure that you on your laptop know how to get that functionality sorted as well. All right. And ideally, check it the night before. I mean, that's a great idea. And even the morning of, okay? Because sometimes maybe someone accidentally knocks your computer or changes the settings. Make sure you're good to go on the day. All right. Next one. Tell people how to respond. Tell people how to respond. Okay. So before we get into the actual I guess, what to say, so to speak, we need to appreciate the quality of your session is going to come down to how much interaction you actually have. It's also going to come down to how much people actually remember from your session. So you want to have regular questions. You also want to have quiz questions at the end. That's a great idea. And you may even want to have quiz questions throughout your session as well. Now, here's what we also recommend though, is ask questions quite regularly to your audience, such as, does that make sense? Such as, if you would agree with that, type yes in the chat box. If you would agree with that, okay, so now let's get into how do we actually get people to respond. So in the online environment or in Zoom, it's a little bit chaotic if you have everybody unmuted and everybody talking, right? So instead, what you want to do, have everybody muted. Have everybody muted, and what you're going to do is you're going to say, okay, you're going to tell them how to respond. So for example, okay, let's go with Bob. Bob, please unmute yourself and answer this question for me. All right. And Bob's going to answer the question. Or you could say, how is everyone today? If you are good today, raise your hand. All right. So you can get people to respond via an action in the camera. If you're feeling great today, give me a thumbs up. All right. Or if you would agree with this statement, give me a thumbs up. Or if you know that you've ever had an injury at work, give me a thumbs down or something like that. Or we can go to the chat box, right? And the chat box is definitely a really powerful place to go to and a great way to get people to respond. So we can ask people to respond in the chat box. So everyone type in the chat box, how are you feeling today? Drop in the chat box, are you feeling good? Are you feeling great? Are you feeling fantastic, right? So we can get people to respond in the chat box. We can say, if you have ever been to Paris, type yes in the chat box. Or we could say, if you think safety is important, type yes in the chat box, right? But the key thing here with number 6 is we have to tell people how to respond. Don't just say, does that make sense? And people are like, oh, yeah, it does, but how do I tell you that, right? So you have to say, if that makes sense for you, type yes in the chat box. Or if that makes sense for you, raise your hand. Or Bob, if that makes sense for you, unmute yourself and say yes for me. All right. So there's 3 different ways that we can do that there, but it's really important we tell people how to respond. Okay. It's not hard, but it's just something we have to add to our delivery repertoire, so to speak. Now let's jump to the phrases side of things. The phrases. All right. So phrases, definitely one of my favorite things to talk about, and let's bring them up here, folks. So phrases, if you're going to present in an online environment, a couple of phrases we really want to be aware of, right? So the first one there is, if you can see my screen, type yes in the chat box, right? Now, the thing is, we have to say that, otherwise, sometimes we could be showing something Maybe they can't see it. We think they can, but they can't actually see it. So we need to be a professional. We need to check in with them and say, if you can see my screen, type yes in the chat box, right? So we want to be a professional about that. Next one, if you're showing a video, you want to say, if you can hear the video, type yes in the chat box, right? You want to check in with them, okay? Can anyone see the video? Can anyone see the video? Right? It gets awkward very quickly. Instead, we want to say, if you can hear the video, type yes in the chat box, right? If you can't hear the video, type no. All right. Cool. It's a great way to handle it there. Next one, number 3 is if, type yes in the chat box. Great simple way to ask questions. So, for example, if you're teaching about manual handling, right? So we could say something like, if you've ever had a back injury because of manual handling, type yes in the chat box, right? If you um, if you've ever uh, if you've ever had a bad day at work, type yes in the chat box, right? So there's a lot of different types of things that we could ask about, and we can use that formula there, right? So if dot dot dot, type yes in the chat box. So next one. All right, number 4. One of the most important phrases that you probably want to be using at least 3 or 4 times in your session. All right. So the phrase is, the biggest thing that I want you to take away from this slide is. The biggest thing that I want you to take away from this slide is. The biggest thing that I want you to take away from this slide is. The biggest thing that I want you to take away from this slide is, right? Highly recommend that you grab a pen and write that phrase down. And actually, I'd be expecting you to be writing all those phrases down. But let's come back to this one here. The biggest thing I want you to take away from this slide is, right? We need to appreciate that your audience, guaranteed, as I've said earlier today, they are going to forget 90% of what you say. All right. So I can't really sugarcoat that. It is what it is. But your job as a trainer, presenter, coach, facilitator, mentor, and someone that's training people to do things is to make sure that they remember what you want them to remember. What a great idea, right? So you need to tell them what you want them to remember. Maybe on the slide, you've got 10 points. All right. And maybe you really, 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 really want them to remember point number 4 and point number 6, and really maybe even point number 9, right? So you might say something like, the biggest thing I want you to take away from this slide is that, and that. And you get people to write that down, okay? Or on another slide, maybe you've got 10 points. You say, all of that is very important, but the biggest theme or the biggest concept I really want you to take away from this slide is blah, blah. All right. So your job as a presenter, as a facilitator, as a trainer of other people is to really tell them the core thing that you really, 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 really want them to remember. Because guaranteed, you're going to show some stuff on a slide, which is going to be great. It's fantastic. I'm sure it's going to look amazing. But you need to take the perspective of your job as a trainer is to tell them the critical takeaways, and you drive home the message. Okay. So how do we do that? Well, we ask questions, we summarize information, we go through information, and we check in for understanding as well. So we say, does that make sense? Now, another cool phrase that we can use here, number 5, and last phrase that we're going to go through is, before I move on, let me check in. Before I move on, let me check in. Okay. So let's imagine that you have taught the top 3 ways to do X, Y, Z. All right. So, hi everyone. Today I'm going to talk to you about the top 3 ways to do X, Y, Z. Maybe lift a box. Let's go back to that example. Hi everyone. Today we're going to talk about manual handling. There are 3 ways to move a box. Now, before I move on, let me check in. Everyone, drop in the chat box. How many ways are there to lift a box? Everyone, drop the number in the chat box. Excellent. Everyone's dropping in the 3. Fantastic. All right. Maybe another time you say, all right, so as part of this workflow, we need to focus on privacy legislation 2008. Before I move on, folks, let me check in. What was the name of that legislation? Drop the name of the legislation in the chat box there for me, if you could, please. So before I move on, let me check in. Before I move on, let me check in. Before I move on, let me check in. All right. So it's a great phrase. It's a really great phrase to get in the habit of, because you don't want to wait to the very end to find out if people have remembered or understood what you've actually said there. Okay. So let's just rewind. What phrase have we got here, folks? If you can see my screen, type yes in the chat box. Okay, it's not a hard phrase to use. It's not a hard phrase to articulate. Just recommend that you write that one down. Just get in the habit of using it. Next one, if you can hear the video, type yes in the chat box. Don't be the person that says, "Can you let me know if you can hear the sound? Can you let me know?" Okay. Instead, just be a professional and say, if you can hear the video, type yes in the chat box, right? Or you can say, if the sound's coming through loud and clear, drop a yes in the chat box, right? Next one, if, type yes in the chat box. So you can ask leading questions or close-ended questions for any topic that you're talking about. If you're talking about, let's say, CPR, if you have ever attended CPR training, type yes in the chat box, right? Great way to lead off your session, okay? Next, number 4, the biggest thing I want you to take away from this slide is, right, really, really get into the place of drilling home and telling your audience what you want them to know. And remember, next one, before I move on, let me check in. Before I move on, let me check in. Before I move on, let me check in. Okay. So, out of all of this, what I'd highly recommend that you do is coming back up to the top here. What have we got? Identify what's the one thing that you want people to remember and never forget. Okay. So maybe you've designed your 20-minute session. I would like you to go back and identify what's the one thing you really, really want them to remember. And maybe it's like one thing or one slide. Go after it, identify that. Next thing, what's the one thing you want people to do as a result of listening to you? Okay. Do you want them to go out and actually speak to someone in a particular way? Or do you want them to stop doing something in a particular way? Or do you want them to pause and think of something before they do something? Do you want them to go out and buy something? Do you want them to go out and, work with other people or start something? Whatever it may be, identify the action you want them to take. Next one, make your slides readable. Review your slides. Just make sure that they are readable and you can see what's going on, and the font is all good and the colors all good. Learning outcomes, dial them back to 3. And if you've got more than 3, it's okay. You'll learn through experience there that the less is better. Number 4, practice bringing up your slides and transitioning to different screens. Not hard, but I just do recommend that you practice it before you turn up on the day there, and that'll make you look like you know what you're doing there, right? But if you struggle, that's okay, because guess what? The trainer will help you out on the day, and you'll be absolutely fine, right? So number 5, test your video and your camera before the day. Great idea. Now, number 6, tell people how to respond, right? So if you are going to ask questions, which I imagine you will, and I'd expect you to, make sure you tell them how to respond. Make sure you say, type in the chat box, or unmute yourself, or give me a sign on the camera, give me a thumbs up or a hand up, whatever it is. And phrases, all right? So we've talked about these quite a few times here, but these phrases will really make you stand out and will give you so much confidence when you deliver online. Now, if you don't watch this video, if you don't pay attention to the video, highly likely your trainer will probably reteach all of this to you on the day anyway. So highly recommend that you just get a handle on some of these things before you turn up. But even if you don't, the trainer will probably teach it to you anyway on the day. So presenting online is a lot of fun. It's really easy, and it's just a different paradigm and a different dynamic to present in. And yes, it's going to be unusual. Yes, it'll be unfamiliar. And the more you do it, the more confident you get. All right. So on that note, hopefully you got some value from the video. You got some tips here to really help you be successful on the day. And the more prep you put in, the even more successful you'll be. Thanks for watching, team, and we look forward to seeing you on presentation day, where we're going to have a lot of fun. You'll be fully supported, and everybody's going to love you, and you're going to love everybody as they deliver the topics that they are really passionate about. Thanks for watching, team, and we wish you all the very best for the day.